scale that kind of fits in between these two other scales of inquiry. We can also think about how hierarchies work. So in a typical hierarchy, we have a focal scale of study. So this is the middle scale in this diagram. We also have a level below it that are often mechanisms, and those mechanisms cause emergent properties to happen, where we might see emergent things happening at our focal scale of inquiry. We also have controls at the broader scale, kind of like what is our boundary conditions that provide a level of control over that focal scale. So in this hierarchy, we can think about how drivers are operating across these different levels of inquiry. So when we add these two things together, we really get to what a macro system is. It's both these temporal and spatial scales that are operating at this macro scale level, but also adding that hierarchical system to it. And work has been done to kind of detail what this means. So on the left here, we have an example, or like the conceptual model of what a macro scale is. So you can have local processes that emerge onto the macro scale level, and then dynamics that are happening at the macro scale level, but also this connection with global processes such as climate. And a good example of this is snow geese. So snow geese migrate from Hudson Bay to the Central Plains area of the US, and they spend their summers at the Hudson Bay along wetlands there, and then they have their winters in the Central Plains of the US. And as farming has come along, there's corn, there's all sorts of farming products that they eat, and so their populations have expanded. And this causes what's called a teleconnection, where that food resource in the central US is called a population expansion that then affects a whole different part of the globe, meaning that Hudson Bay area. And the Hudson Bay is now seeing declines in their wetlands, where these snow geese, the populations have expanded so much that they're really affecting their system, the system up there. That's one great example of how like a macro system might work. Another good example is thinking about deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. So we have these economic drivers broadly, like global economic drivers for produce, for agriculture, that then cause demand. And again, I'm very sorry. That then cause demand for farming products out of the Amazon, and that pasture demand causes forest clearing at the local level and changes to the ecosystem that then emerge up back into the macro system. And studies have shown that the Amazon has its own climate, and so those changes at the local scale on a broader basis across the whole basin then change the climate of the Amazon. So this is another good example of how understanding things across scales can help us detail how smaller changes at local scale can emerge up into the macro scale, but also how global pressures can influence local scale as well. Another important part about macro systems is that it not only includes the geophysical drivers and the biological drivers of a system, but you also put humans into the system when you consider things at this scale. So things like land use change, natural resource extraction, anything that you can think of that has to do with like environmental amenities or attitudes can be put into this system. So it not only incorporates biological and geophysical, but also social, cultural. Okay, so that was a lot about macro systems. Let's bring it back to a marsh and a coastal wetland, and why I think that this is a good example of a system that could use this framework to understand how coastal wetlands might go into the future, with the pressures that they are operating under. So we've thought a lot about how coastal wetlands persist on the local scale. And a lot of this is driven by work thinking about elevation. So coastal wetlands exist at this elevation in between the high tide and the low tide. If they become too high in elevation, they're terrestrial, they don't get flooded enough. If they become too low in elevation, the plants drown, and plants are a really important part of a coastal wetland system. So they have this what kind of like Goldilocks elevation that they persist at. And that soil elevation can be thought of as being a combination of biotic and abiotic factors that influence it. So because coastal wetlands are anoxic places where the plants and the carbon from that system can persist through time, plant growth and then the decay and death of those plants can be one thing that ends up adding to that soil elevation. But we can also think about the abiotic components such as sedimentation from the waters that surround that coastal wetland as an important thing in maintaining that elevation. And finally, historically, we've thought about these things and how they relate to kind of things outside of the system. So the boundary conditions, what are the sea level rise conditions? What are the eutrophication conditions outside of these things that might impact the local level drivers of soil elevation? And what I want to talk about today is how to take that local scale and start to connect it to macro scale drivers. So if we think about plant growth, that's one thing that can emerge up into the macro scale into like regional wetland patterns. So where do mangroves exist along our coastlines, and how do certain types of estuaries, what kind of wetland patterns do they have? We can also think about how climate at the macro scale can affect things like sedimentation, like flooding depth along parts of our coastline. And we can also think about how humans can influence this system. So how can things like upland land use, such as agriculture, influence the nutrients that we see at the local scale? And we can also start to connect these macro scale drivers to larger global patterns, such as the global carbon budget, the global climate cycle, and also things like human migration across our landscape. And to do this, we need to combine different types of studies. So we can think about field studies that happen at the local scale, but also adding things like geospatial analysis of large scale data sets and trying to understand the proxies of different patterns that we see. We can also think about data analytics as a way of harnessing big data sets to understand this broader scale of data inquiry. So having diverse types of data, but then also diverse teams is really important. So there's this really great paper that came out last year that was called, it's like the best title. It's like your system is my boundary condition. So we need diverse teams that think about different systems in order to connect those systems together, because oftentimes we're thinking about different scales and understanding how your boundary conditions might be another person's system, and connecting those two things together is important when considering things across these different types of scales. Okay, that was a mouthful about macrosystems. I am now going to talk about a study that I did looking at the local scale processes within a salt marsh along the Gulf Coast and the impacts of disturbance on that marsh. So when we think about coastal marshes, we think about this transect from water to land. And along that transect, there are disturbances that every marsh has to deal with, such as salinity, such as flooding. And those disturbances are diverse along that transect, right? Like if you have a plant that's sitting at the edge of that transect along the water boundary, it gets flooded pretty frequently, but that also means that the flooding pulses nutrients and takes away things like sulfides out of the system, so that they tend to be like bigger and healthier. Whereas if you go to like the middle part of that transect, it might be more stagnant. It might have more salt from evapotranspiration, and those plants might be stunted and smaller. And then we head up into the terrestrial area where you have an ecotone from that salt marsh to the terrestrial ecosystems. So we see diverse stressors that happen locally across this transect that play a role in the way that these plants recover from disturbance. We also know that salt marshes, particularly in the Gulf Coast, have large-scale disturbances that affects them. So we all know that hurricanes often hit the Gulf Coast, and these hurricanes bring with them floods that can both impact the vegetation, but also impact the vegetation, but also bring sediment with them. And we've seen that there's fire regimes in the pines there that can also jump into marshes along the Gulf Coast. So in studies in Mississippi, we've seen that fires in the pines can jump into the high marsh area where there's a lot of rack and burn into marshes in the Gulf Coast. So they're facing these two larger scale disturbances in addition to the daily disturbances of flooding that they face. So we wanted to understand in Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, At first, we wanted to look at a study trying to understand how prescribed burning can be used to get rid of hurricane debris, and how it could be used to like burn up wood or whatever kind of debris is washed up from hurricanes that creates localized patches of die-off within that marsh. And we also wanted to find out how that burning would affect the processes that end up with elevation building in the marsh. But what ended up happening is we started this study and then we got hit by 2 hurricanes. So we had Hurricane Ike and Hurricane Gustav hit the area. It was not a direct hit on Grand Bay. That was about 1.5 meters of flooding or storm surge with both of these hurricanes, but it was enough to cause an effect in our marsh. So we start off with a burn study, and as often happens with science, it turns into something else. So we now have a double disturbance study to look at the effects of 2 different disturbances, one right after the other on a salt marsh. So our primary question was, what are the effects of fire and hurricane on the soil building processes in these salt marsh ecosystems? And the things that we were interested in is how it affects the primary productivity, but also how it affects the accretion of the system. And what I mean by accretion is that sediment that builds up on top of the marsh surface. So thinking about really the 2 main drivers of our soil elevation in the system. And we came up with some hypotheses that kind of led to some path-dependent predictions that we might have. So we thought, okay, if we have a hurricane first, we might expect that a lot of that dead parts of plants, a lot of that rack might move from the marsh into the ecotone, might be removed as that water comes into the system and floods the system. And that would lead to a less intense fire second, and that you might see less die-off of those plants in the fire. We also predicted that we would see, because of there would be all of the plants, if the hurricane happened first, that we would see more sediment accretion as those plants slow down the water and sediment falls out and gets trapped with those plants. So we would see more sediment accretion if the hurricane happened first. We also thought about if the fire happened first and the hurricane second, we might see a more intense fire because that dead rack and the dead parts of the plants would be left in the marsh, leading to less dense marsh as the hurricane happened. And that would lead to less surface accretion because you don't have the same number of stems, slowing the water, causing sediment deposition and trapping sediment on their stems. And because of the stochastic nature of this study, we really are measuring this first instance. The second was kind of like a thought process, but we hope maybe one day that we would be able to do fire first and hurricane second, but that's not always the easiest thing to predict. Like when a hurricane is going to happen. So at the moment we're measuring A and B, and whether that is what we're seeing in this study. So we had a series of 6 transects, 3 burned and 3 unburned, and we measured things across an elevational, 3 elevational stations in each transect. So a low, a mid, and a high, going from the water to the pine ecotone. And along each station, we were measuring pore water, accretion, compaction, redox, and above and below ground biomass. So first of all, with the fire, the first thing that we saw is that indeed the fire was less intense than would have been if the rack was there. We saw that a lot of that dead debris ended up in the pine ecotone, and that we had a less intense fire because there just wasn't as much dead stuff. And here's a before and after where you can see that it did get rid of a lot of the vegetation, but there was still vegetation left even post burn. So we were seeing a decrease in the total amount of biomass, but not as an intensive a fire as we might have expected if a hurricane had not happened. And so just to orient you to this plot, we have live above ground biomass on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And we're looking at unburned plots in A and burned plots in B across those 3 elevational stations, so low, mid, and high. And the first thing that we see if we follow this blue arrow down is that the hurricane really didn't cause any changes to the above ground biomass. Again, it wasn't a direct hit. It was only about 1.5 meters of flooding. So we didn't see any changes to the live above ground biomass after that hurricane. But after the fire in plot B, what we do see is that we have a pretty significant decrease in our above ground biomass. So we see that the fire did enough to like decrease our live above ground biomass. And then when we look at that recovery post fire over time, we found that there were locational differences in this above ground recovery. And we found that those were across any type of comparison that we had, whether that was to the pre-summer biomass or a mean pre-burn or the control biomass. We saw that low places that had a lot of pulsing from that water coming in daily tended to recover faster than mid or the high, possibly showing that the stressors were less in that those low plots. We also looked at accretion. So again, this is exchanging accretion on the Y, and then A is our unburned and B is our burned. We saw that with accretion, that this hurricane, the blue arrow coming down, really drove the accretion gains that we saw across the study. And those accretion gains from the hurricane lasted pretty much the whole study. So in some instances, we saw up to 15 millimeters of accretion post-hurricane, and that persisted. And again, we're seeing these locational differences where low plots that are closest to the water end up having the most accretion gain from these hurricanes than the mid or the high. And that could be expected because that water is coming in first over the low marsh areas and would be trapped first kind of by the plants there, and then the mid or the high. So to kind of sum up what we're seeing here in these local processes that affect our soil building is that first we found that vegetation really was affected by this fire. We did see that there was less of a decrease in the vegetation than we would expect, though, than if the hurricane had not happened, and the fire was less intense than we would expect if that dead vegetation was all there. We also found that the accretion was boosted by the hurricane, and that accretion boost lasted for the rest of the time period. We also found that disturbance impacts were different across the transect. So we're really seeing patterns of different elevational stressors that might impact recovery from disturbance. So this might mean that a marsh platform can't be treated the same when we're thinking about disturbances. There are elevational stressors and elevational differences that might mean that the marsh platform recovers differently post-disturbance. And finally, we expect that these things are path dependent. Again, we couldn't measure the fire first, the hurricane second, but we would expect that if they happened in the opposite way around, that we might have different results. Okay, so we are back at the marsh. And we've talked about how local processes can affect soil building, and disturbance can affect soil building. Large scale disturbance can affect soil building. And these processes can cause patterns locationally that lead to differences amongst a marsh platform in how they deal with disturbance, how that marsh platform deals with disturbance. So second, I want to talk about watersheds and how watersheds can cause, or the connection to watersheds by marshes can lead to differences in marsh formation, and how humans can also cause marsh formation. So we've talked a little bit about how plants can trap and slow water, leading to sediment deposition. So if we have this, hypothetical marsh platform and a slow rate of sea level rise, those plants do a really good job of trapping that sediment. And models show that under this rate of sea level rise, plants in the marsh keep up with elevation. And even under like a higher rate of sea level rise, because you have more sediment coming onto that platform, and the plant's trapping more sediment, that models show that platform will maintain itself under a little bit higher rates of sea level rise. But if we get to really high rates of sea level rise, plants drown and are unable to keep up with the processes that lead to elevation gain, and those coastal wetlands can't persist. So what happens during interglacial cycles, such as when a major ice sheet melts, is that the water level goes up so quickly. For instance, when the Laurentide ice sheet melted, the sea level rise goes up so quickly that those plants can't maintain their elevation relative to sea level, and you get drowning. So most people think that our coastal marshes, or most of our coastal marshes, were formed as sea level rise slowed down after the last ice age about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. But recent work in Grand Bay by Kerwin et al., and then in the Mississippi Birdfoot Delta by Tweel and Turner, has suggested that we also saw this time of increase in marshes after European colonization. So Europeans come in, they settle areas, they deforest and put agriculture on areas, and that would have caused erosion from these areas that were once forest. And Kerwin et al. Found up to a 50% increase in marsh formation when he looked across this area of Plum Island, leading to some hypotheses that we would have seen marshes being formed by this, this land use change, basically sediment pulses coming down our rivers. And Tweel and Turner found the same thing, with the light gray area being expansion of the Birdfoot Delta after ag comes into the Mississippi River Delta. But we don't really know if this was a widespread pattern or if these were more site-specific or location-specific effects. And I don't want you to like try to read this whole diagram, but this is across LTER sites. And what I wanted to get across here is that across the East and the Gulf coasts of the United States, we have varying times of different periods of ag, industrialization, post-industrial time period, and that varied across our different regions. So the colors represent different time periods, whether that's colonizing, ag, industrialization, post-industrial time period. And those time periods would also coincide with things like dam building that might stop that sediment pulse from coming down. So we wouldn't expect that everywhere we would be able to see this post-colonial effect of agricultural change, but that some places those things might align where we would be able to see that. So where and when this is happening it was really the goal of this study. So what we did is we made a core database. So we took any study that had a core that took like a long marsh core. So they went out to a marsh, they took a core, and they dated the marsh based on this like basal peat layer. So the beginning and the formation of the marsh. And we collected information about those particular cores. So when we looked across the East and Gulf Coast, these are the core samples that came up. We also connected them to things like distance from the ocean. So distance from the ocean gives you a measure of the marine processes that might also lead to wetland formation, whether that be resuspension of sediment from storms or things like barrier island washover events where you have, sand coming from the front of the barrier island to the back of the barrier island and forming marshes on the other side of the barrier island. We also looked at river to tide ratio, which was a way to gauge how big a river is in comparison to its estuary. And you would expect that places with bigger rivers and bigger watersheds have a bigger sediment supply, and therefore that might play a role in when a wetland was formed. So we were looking at different proxies to try to disentangle what is driving these patterns we see. We also did our own core collection. So we went out and took cores ourselves and radiocarbon dated those. And these were in paired sites from Massachusetts to Georgia, one pair that was less river influenced and one pair that was, one side of the pair that was more river influenced and one side that was less. So a good example of this would be like the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, which is a really river dominated system, and Masonboro Island, very near the Cape Fear, which is more of a barrier island system. So thinking of something that's more marine dominated and one that's more river dominated. And we also use the same variables that we're using in the core database to try to understand the patterns that we saw across these field sites. So I'm going to lead you through the predictions as a way to try to help explain the results that we see. So we looked at the distribution of ages and looked at the number of cores that had particular ages. And so we have increasing age on the y-axis, and then the count of wetland cores on the on the x-axis is increasing age, on the y-axis is the count of wetland cores. So we would expect that if sea level rise and that rate of sea level rise is a big driver, that we would see this big pulse of wetlands formed after sea level rise slows down, or the rate of sea level rise slows down. We would also expect that places that have a high river to tide ratio or river dominated, so they have a big sediment supply from that river, would also form around the same time period, because they would there'd be enough sediment for those places to raise their elevation and really form quickly after the rate of sea level rise stabilized. We expect that places with a lower river tide ratio, that mode might be shifted a little bit so that they're younger wetlands, because it's just they don't have the same sediment supply and they grow more slowly. They form more slowly than the high river to tide ratio. We might also expect that places closer to the coast, you would see the same bump after sea level rise stabilized, but then you might also see a younger bump where places that have a lot of marine influence are forming cores that are forming wetlands that are younger because of these dynamic marine processes that are happening. And then we would also expect a younger bump if we see this European colonization signal. So if we see marshes forming after Europeans came and land use change happened, we would expect to see a younger signal. So what I'm showing here, it means that there's like a really, these distributions are messy, but trying to pick them apart through our proxies, we can start to untangle what we might be seeing in these distributions. So I want to start with this one. We have the proportion of cores on the y-axis and the age on the x-axis, and this black line is approximately European colonization. The first thing that we found was actually something we didn't expect to find, which is in our database, the study really, or the intent of the study really changed the results that we were seeing. So sea level rise studies go to pretty stable marshes. They collect long cores to get at multiple states of sea level rise over the past. So they're really getting these old long cores from older marshes. And we see that with the distribution that we see here, really corresponding to the an older mode associated with the stabilization of the rate of sea level rise. Whereas if we looked at other types of studies, maybe ones that were doing marsh natural history or some other type of study, we see that distribution is much more varied and that we have younger cores, possibly showing that we can't even really answer these questions yet because our studies don't necessarily reflect the goals of what we might need to do to go out and say why and when were marshes formed. So that was an interesting result that we didn't really expect to find. Secondly, we looked at this, again, this river to tide ratio that gives you an idea of how big the watershed is in comparison to the estuary. So the blue ones have a bigger river. These are logged, by the way, the river to tide ratio, have a bigger river in comparison to their estuary. And we see, as we expect, this with the blue ones, they form pretty quickly after that rate of sea level rise slowed. Whereas with the yellow and the red or the green, we see that distribution has shifted a little bit and that there are younger cores, meaning that it just took longer for those wetlands to form because the sediment supply was less. We can also look at this regionally. So going from Maine to the top to the Gulf Coast at the bottom, we see that some regions have a pretty uncomplicated distribution. They're pretty related to that rate of sea level rise slowing. In places like Maine and the mid-Atlantic, we just really see one mode in our distribution. Where in places like the Northeast and the Southeast, the distribution is much flatter. And we see a lot more younger cores, probably pointing to other drivers, possibly pointing to European colonization as a reason that, or as a signal in these particular areas. But it definitely seems like there's regional differences in the formation processes happening in these areas. We also looked at the distance from the coast, again, to try to get a handle on the marine processes that also cause marsh formation. So H at the top is farthest from the coast and I is closest to the coast. And as you look down the line here, you can see that you go from a very simple distribution with a main mode that's right after when the sea level rise would have slowed, all the way to I, where it's much more complex and you're seeing younger cores, you're seeing younger wetlands forming, showing that these marine processes really do cause marsh formation. So when we think about this as a whole, we found a couple of things. First of all, watershed sediment supply does seem to be playing a role in how quickly marshes were formed and when they were formed. We also saw that there could be regional differences across in marsh formation along our eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast, and that there might be a signal of European colonization in maybe the Northeast and the Southeast. We also saw that increasing distance from the coast, so those marine processes can also drive wetland formation, and that the closer that you are to the coast, the more dynamic those processes might be. So we're back here, back at the marsh. I'm going to take another sip of water. So, talked about local processes. We've talked about how these systems are connected to their watersheds through sediment deposition, but also marine processes, and also how humans can have an influence on these systems. Next, I'm going to talk about humans in the system and novel landforms. So this is work that I'm doing right now. So this is, you're going to have to bear with me. It's fresh, and the results are not as polished as the other studies. But we know that human alteration is pervasive and persistent across our landscapes. You can see that in the spoil islands, in the canals that we dig in our wetland landscapes, and particularly in places like New York and Long Island. Here's a marsh in Long Island where we can see mosquito dishes. They can be even visible on aerial imagery. So the Conservation Corps in the 1930s and across the New England area dug a lot of mosquito ditches as seen in this picture, and those mosquito ditches are still with us. We've also seen in places like the Southeast that rice plantations dug canals, formed weirs to create places that were good for growing rice. And those systems are still with us as well. Here is a former rice plantation that is now just marsh. So in the mosquito ditch example, it's a system that people are still actively maintaining. There's still places that dredge their mosquito ditches, but in the rice plantation, this is something that is not actively maintained, but we can still see its imprint on the landscape. So these are things that we don't always think about in the way that we think about our wetland systems, but they're pervasive. They're across our landscape. So how do we start to understand how these, what we're terming novel landforms, impact the way these systems function and also the ecosystem services they provide? So when thinking about these systems, a ton of questions come up. First of all, how pervasive are these altered landscapes? Where are they? How do they function? Over what timescales do they maintain themselves or not? Are we actually maintaining these novel landforms? And are there consistent and predictable geomorphic shifts in landscapes with similar climate and geology? So what I mean by that are we trying to drain landscapes, and therefore we end up putting a lot of canals and ditches and things in there? Are we trying to bring water to landscapes, so we're putting the same sort of systems in? Are places becoming more like each other because of the ways that we're altering them? So in this work, my collaborators and I are trying to start addressing these questions, but also trying to put a system into place to try to understand how we can address these questions. So the first thing that we did is we took the most cited geomorphic studies across the world. And as you can see, most of those tend to be in the US and in Europe, but we looked at what they were looking at. Was it a natural system? Was it an altered system? Was it climate change they were thinking about? And some of the things that came out of this were, well, basically we think a lot about natural systems, but we also think about them in certain areas. So we tend to think about them in cool or cold climates and wet areas, and also tend to think about on the mountains. So there is a lot of room for growth in thinking about altered systems and how they function, considering that it is a pervasive change across the whole globe. So we then took a couple case studies, and the one I'm going to present to you today is the coastal wetland one that I've been working on. So what we did was we took LIDAR in North Carolina and South Carolina and looked at places that were altered and places that were natural or unaltered, and try to understand what sort of changes we've made on the system. And you can see from the channel outlets, and what I mean by that is, like in a natural wetland, you might have a coastal, a tidal stream that has an outlet, but then in these altered systems, we're digging channels. So we can see that in altered systems, the number of channels goes up significantly, and that we see that they're very separate from the way that these unaltered systems are working, possibly showing that the drainage patterns are different in these areas, and the and how frequently they are flooded is probably different. We also looked at the elevation, and we found that altered marshes tended to have a higher elevation, but also a very long tail of depth, showing that like those ditches were probably also had a very long tail, and that we are possibly drying these systems more, which makes sense. Like if you think of a mosquito ditch, the reason they're digging that mosquito ditch is to dry the area so that there are no mosquitoes. So that we're drying these areas more, probably leading to differences in their biogeochemistry and their ability to sequester carbon. So I'm going to end this with kind of the way that we're thinking about these systems moving forward. We really want to involve the socioeconomic technological setting that's causing these systems to form, and then think about how they age over time, and really thinking about how our new frame of mind or our new socioeconomic technological setting leads to our decision landscape of whether we want to restore a system or reassess its use or abandon a system. And so thinking about these across both a temporal scale, where we can think about the ways it was formed and the ways they are now, and then also how they're operating currently, can give us a better idea about novel landforms and the ways that we see them in our coastal systems and beyond. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how pervasive humans can be, and I'm going to take one more sip of water. So I promised you a lot of macro system talk. So this final bit, which I'm going to try to go through pretty quickly, is how we can fit it all into a macro scale framework. So we know across our coasts, there are big differences in the wetland patterns that we see, with some places like coastal Georgia having extensive wetlands, and some places like the Neuse River and the Albemarle-Pamlico estuary having fringing wetlands. So what is driving these patterns? Why do we see extensive wetlands in some places and not others? And this is critical, because if we can identify their drivers, we can identify how the drivers are changing over time and how they might change into the future, affecting wetland persistence into the future. So for this study, we took a GIS geoprocessing framework where we were using publicly available data sets. Our response variable was wetland extent. And what I mean by that is the percentage of the estuary that has wetlands. So an extensive wetland wetland extent would be one that was, mostly filled in with wetlands with small water channels, and a less extensive wetland extent would be one that had fringing. We took watershed characteristics such as the size of the watershed land use, as well as estuary characteristics such as the depth of the estuary and estuarine land use and the tidal range. And finally, we put humans into it with shoreline development. Again, we can think about soil elevation and the local vertical drivers of soil elevation, as we've talked about earlier, but there's also lateral feedbacks that drive wetland extent. And what I mean by that is that fetch, or the distance with which wind waves can pick up. So if you have a bigger distance of open water, a lot of wind waves can pick up, can drive two alternative attractors of wetlands extent. One, on one side of a critical threshold that leads to rapidly eroding wetlands as those wind waves can eat at the shoreline, and the other on the other side of that critical threshold that leads to more extensive wetlands where you have smaller open water where the wind waves can't pick up, and therefore you have stable conditions where wetlands can grow. So models have predicted that these critical thresholds exist across basins based on sediment concentration and rates of sea level rise, where you cross from expanding to contracting basins across this threshold based on those variables. And this is work done by Mariotti and Fagarazzi. So in our empirical work, we wanted to look at, okay, well, how would this happen operationally if we were just looking at data? And we expected that it would be through bimodal distributions. And what I mean by that is that we would have one attractor with lower wetland extent and one attractor with high wetland extent. So we should see two modes in our distributions of wetland extent. So we looked at this across an estuary area gradient, going from small estuary area on the left-hand side to large estuary area on the right-hand side, and increasingly red colors mean more positive tests for multimodality, more likely that they have two modes. And we can see here that at the smallest estuary size, we really are seeing these two modes of estuary or wetland extent, a less extensive and a more extensive. But as we get bigger across these estuary sizes, that seems to dissipate and go away until we're at like the largest scale where we're not really seeing that any longer. We're just seeing fringing estuaries. And this really shows that these feedbacks, these lateral feedbacks are operating at a small scale, a small local scale, and that's influencing the patterns of wetland extent that we're seeing. So I'm going to orient this figure to you quickly because I'm going to come back to this, but it's basically a way to sum up all of our results. And it's going from the Huck 4 to the Huck 12 scale across the top there. So Huck 4 is like the size of the Albemarle Pamlico estuary. Whereas a Huck 12 would be a subtributary of the Neuse River. So really going from expansive estuary size to this really small estuary size and along these Huck scales. So for internal feedbacks, we see that they're really operating at this smallest Huck 12 scale. Again, we thought about this with watersheds. So how does a watershed affect the wetland patterns that we see? And we did again with river to tide ratios. So we were looking at the watershed size in comparison to the estuary. So higher river to tide ratio means that you have a large watershed that might provide a lot of sediment relative to your estuary. So we would expect that as you go from small river to tide ratio to large river to tide ratio, you would see increasing wetland extent. And we seem to find this when we put it into a regression model, we seem to find this at the largest scale. So these seem to be operating at the largest scale of estuary size where we see this increasing wetland extent with larger river to tide ratio. Next, we looked at shoreline complexity. And what I mean by that is a circle, you can get more fetch than a star, which you can have less fetch if you draw a straight line through it. So we expect the more complex shapes, more star-like shapes, you would get increasing wetland extent because you just can't build up the same fetch that you can with the smaller or with a circle. And we find that in our results that this is happening at the most circular and the most star-like patterns, but there's a lot in the middle that are all across the board. And again, when we put this into our multi-regression model, we find that this is happening at the smallest scale, possibly showing that these complexities are really looking at the same scale as those lateral feedbacks. So they're operating amongst those small scales. So when we look at this, we see really complex things happening. I'm not going to try to take you through the whole thing and all of our variables, but I will say that larger scale variables that you would expect to operate at the bigger areas, such as like estuary area and river to tide ratio, are operating at these large estuary scale sizes, meaning that there's large portions of the coastline that have these drivers that are going to affect your wetland extent, whereas these more local patterns of wetland drivers are also happening at the smaller scale size. So understanding like what scale of operation your driver is operating at helps us to determine how changes in those drivers might affect both local and larger estuary patterns, wetland patterns. So we're back here at the Marsh, done a lot of talking. Just to sum it up, we found that local processes of disturbances can affect soil building processes. So we can see that those are locationally different, and those locational patterns and how they respond to disturbance might affect the way that a marsh area as a whole responds to large scale disturbance. We also found that watersheds and coastal processes and humans can all control wetland formation, really tying them to these larger systems. We saw that humans change landforms across our coastal ecosystems in ways that we might not think about, but are often pervasive. And so considering them in our system is really important. And finally, when we put it all together, we can see that ecogeomorphic drivers of wetlands operate at different scales, and understanding which scale you're operating on can help show like whether those patterns are emergent or whether you have top-down control across our wetland area, and how macro systems can help us understand that. And I just want to say again, making a plug for macro systems, I think that these ecogeomorphic processes in wetlands are a perfect place to think about how the macro scale can help us understand the patterns that we see locally. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all my collaborators and anyone who's provided me research money or money to fund myself. And I will take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anna. Let me quit this video.
Should I stop? Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Thanks so much. In true macrosystem scale, you brought us from the soil core all the way to the entire eastern seaboard. We always
Yeah, it was a lot towards the end, I was realizing.
No, not at all. And I think it's really cool, especially for students, to see that you can investigate questions about ecosystem structure and function at such a wide variety of scales, but also with the tools that vary from, the core in the back of the truck to some, fancy GIS and statistical modeling. And answering big questions requires all of that. You really just, picking one
Yeah.
scale to ask the question might not get you the same answer. So we'll go to questions. Andrew, I see you've got your video on. You have a question for Anna.
There we go. Yeah, that was a nice talk. I mean, it was a nice kind of survey of a lot of your work over the past 2 years. So thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious. I mean, because I haven't done much work in marshes for the past few years, but I know in general ecologists are confronted with this question of sort of global processes versus like local impacts, and oftentimes it comes down to, how do you communicate this to, say, managers that need to make a decision? Processes do you kind of account for in terms of strategies? So I'm just curious, like, given that it's like your body of work is nice because it looks a lot about processes operating at these various scales. Oftentimes scientists tend to focus on kind of one or the other based on their sort of, bag of tricks. So what's your sort of answer to sort of the more like manager or lay public when they're asking like, what should I be worried about in my marsh? What can I do to kind of like, hopefully get this marsh to persist kind of longer term when thinking about all these processes?
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I think it really depends. Like there are some drivers of marsh loss that are very local and very easy to deal with on the scale of like a manager or stakeholders in the area. But there's other drivers of marsh loss that take, like you think about the Mississippi River Delta, and that's a huge, huge area to like deal with the drivers of marsh loss in the Mississippi, and takes national scale, federal scale implementation of regulations to deal with. So I think that's a scale dependent, or like, a marsh dependent question, and understanding what you're dealing with is kind of what I'm advocating for. It's trying to help people understand whether they are dealing with like a local scale process that might be easier to deal with on the local level, or if it is the Mississippi River Delta and we're dealing with a major federal scale process that is harder to control.
All right. Yeah, thanks. So let me ask a kind of a related or follow-up question then. So let's say there is a manager that's kind of got kind of jurisdiction, or a municipality's got jurisdiction over there, like a marsh. Mm-hmm. Based on sort of your research and the perspective you've developed, like what are some things that, there's like, obviously there's like fire management, there's potentially how you manage like ditching or canals in your marsh. What have you sort of gleaned are some potential strategies where a manager could enhance sort of resilience from those larger scale processes that might be outside their control?
Yeah, I think getting a handle on like your water chemistry and your sediment load is really important. I think understanding, for instance, I was just talking to somebody who was thinking locally about levees that are along, coastlines that aren't even accounted for in our mapping because they're so old, and like having an idea about like those local things that might be driving marsh change that are very local that you can do something about is the first things to deal with. I think that again, like coming together on the watershed scale probably makes the most difference for things like water chemistry and sediment load and things like that. But knowing the local variables that like sea level rise, like the type of nutrients that you've got going on, what kind of sediment load you have, like what does your geomorphology look like, are the important things to get a handle on to start to tackle some of the local or smaller local things that you can do. That was a very broad question. I mean, very broad answer, but I think, again, like, I think it's very dependent on whether you're in New England or you're in, South Florida. I mean, it can depend on what your local pressures are. So.
Yeah, thanks. I know it's a challenge. I know that increasingly scientists are asked to come in and kind of address kind of a local audience oftentimes.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
But we've got a much bigger perspective, and I just kind of wanted to hear your take on what you communicate or how you kind of have those conversations.
Yeah. Well, hearing you discuss some of those drivers and how you might apply them, it actually made me think, and maybe this is a stupid or a crazy idea, but you found that during this period of European settlement, there was potentially marsh expansion because of higher availability of sediments and the sort of newer marshes. And I hadn't thought of that before. I think it's a really cool idea to test. But of course, we've seen from all over the place, local and regional marsh loss, likely due to sea level rise. And it's reminding me of being in a meeting like 20 years ago now about all the marshes in Jamaica Bay and New York City being drowned out by sea level rise. And I'll just say I was much younger at the time. I said, well, why are we doing such a good job controlling sediment from our landscapes if the marshes need sediment? So could you think about, of course, sediment erosion and subsequent sort of pollution from sediment is a big thing we've been trying to prevent. But is there a role for, engineered sediment enhancement to protect coastal marshes from sea level rise decline? If we did it 300 years ago, do it
yeah,
again?
I mean, it's like the restoration projects where they're spraying sediment on top of a marsh. It's exactly what they're doing, right? They're putting X number of years of sediment on a top of a marsh to get it to a height that it can deal with the current conditions, because the conditions that they had that may be under formation are not there any longer. So there are restoration techniques that are starting to push towards adding sediment to systems. I should also say that this is becoming somewhat of a contentious topic in geomorphology, because there's people that have said that we're seeing resuspension out of estuaries and this isn't really a problem, and that like sediment loads in certain places haven't even reached the coast. So this is still like an ongoing topic about like where sediment coming from rivers is important versus resuspension in the marine environment. But yeah, there definitely starting to be ways for restoration to deal with sediment deficits.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten a bit over time, so I know students, you might need to go to your next class. So just join me in thanking Dr. Braswell for her talk today, and welcome to UF, and good luck as you continue on this way. The work is really exciting, and interested to hear more. So we'll definitely have you back as soon as you're willing. Again.
Yeah, I can talk about Zillow again. I mean, I didn't even touch on Zillow. So
yeah, absolutely. We'll get you. We'll put you on the list.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Anna. It's really nice to meet you, and thanks everyone for attending. We'll see your weekly write-up for all the students. Please get that in, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.